But we do want to, within this session, to move away from the plenary format to a conversation. So we'll respond to Francois' plenary session, comments from the panel, but as soon as possible I'd like to bring in comments from the floor and start the conversation towards what we're going to do later this afternoon in breakout groups and really start trying to connect some of the principles that we're talking about to individual contexts. In a minute, I'm going to ask each of our three panelists to give an immediate response to Francois' plenary and some of the major questions that they'd like to bring out. We've got Janet Enever from Umeå University in Sweden, and so in a way represents Sweden, which is well known for being a country that certainly embraced English in a way, but also Janet is an expert, especially in English language teaching at younger ages, in the primary age, and edited the book Early Language Learning in Europe, following a big European project that she managed. Wai Yin from the quite new English Language Institute of Singapore, again, a hugely successful country, a hugely multilingual country, which has used English for particular reasons. Gary Mottram from Manchester University, who has for the last few years run a master's degree in the use of technology, essentially, in language teaching, but also has a vast range of experience from different language policies around the world. Janet, can I start with you for some immediate responses to?
Yes. Okay, yeah, this comes through, okay, good. Well, first of all, I would like to say thank you to Francois for a very illuminating talk, much of which I'm still struggling to process, I have to admit, because there was so much packed in there, but I need to go away and think about many of the issues that were raised. Perhaps my first response was around this area of multilingualism, which I absolutely agree is a high priority globally today and is increasingly very evident on many national language policies. The question for me probably is about how to achieve that level of motivation which is necessary for young people in schools to actually develop that attitude and motivation to sustain them through the whole school curriculum to actually become multilingual. And I quote here perhaps two little bits of evidence, just as illustrative of the point. I know of some data from Finland, where, as you know, as you probably know, there's been a history of Swedish and Finnish being jointly important languages in the school curriculum, and of English being introduced throughout the curriculum and being a major language throughout the country. The evidence from Jyväskylä University looking at the attitudes of 15-year-olds to English and Swedish for social purposes used outside the classroom indicated that although they achieved well in the school system in both languages, they didn't continue to use their Swedish outside the classroom much, if at all. Whereas for English, they used it very substantially. I think this is gone. For social purposes outside the classroom. And in the end, I guess we all, if we're learning languages in schools, need to move to the stage where we make use of them outside the classroom in some ways. And the evidence there seems to suggest that for whatever reason, they didn't find Swedish of use to their lives outside the classroom. How to overcome that problem, I don't have the immediate answers, but it's certainly food for thought. In Sweden, there are 5 national minority languages, which officially have status and can be taught in schools where this is viewed by the local community to be a priority. there continue to be many complications about how effectively to do this. And I won't go into all the examples, but let me just take the Sami language as one example. There are 3 varieties of Sami: Southern Sami, Central Sami, and Northern Sami. Many of the learners of Sami in primary schools in Sweden today are not users of Sami in their homes. They are perhaps second generation or even third generation, where their families want them to become fluent in Sami. For some of the children, they don't see any value in it at all. And so in terms of language revitalization, again, how to address that issue when the children themselves don't see it as relevant to their lives is a really serious question. So this whole issue of multilingualism is not quite as simple as we would like to think. Just providing the opportunities in the schools clearly isn't the full answer to it. And so I look forward to ideas of how to overcome these issues.
Indeed, following on from what you say there, Janet, I think Francois showed us examples of rates of return within Switzerland of, if you like, the national languages plus the lingua franca of English, perhaps, but presumably the same rates of return would not necessarily apply with other languages which weren't seen to have the same, which is perhaps your point. Gary, can I ask you for some comments, and then perhaps Francois can come back on to some of the issues overall.
Okay, well, it's interesting to think about multilingualism in the context of the UK. I mean, it isn't my specialist area, and one of the things that strikes me, I mean, there was a recent survey of Manchester, for example. The second language of Manchester is Polish, and in terms of the actual, you go to a typical Manchester school, and the range of languages that are spoken in that school, either in the playground, at home, in the community, is enormous. That's despite the fact that we're considered a monolingual country with a very poor record in language learning. So there are very interesting questions there, and clearly with the rise of economies like India, China and places like that, in terms of people's ability to contribute to the UK society in terms of prosperity, one that people who are bilingual may not it's interesting the way this microphone's working. Maybe not in terms of the languages that are officially taught in school, like, for example, Spanish or French or German, but the undercurrent languages, if you like, the languages of the community, are going to be the languages that are going to be important. So perhaps children who are multilingual in that sense, in the sense of being Chinese speakers at home, Putonghua, particularly Mandarin Chinese, and many learners, many of the students go to classes to learn Mandarin at a weekend, that they're going to make a contribution probably in a way that perhaps the official languages that are taught in the schools aren't going to make it. So it's a very, as people are saying, it's a very complex question. And maybe policy needs to be much more, diverse, much more, opportunistic in that sense. And actually, you do see that quite a lot with children opting to do GCSEs in their community languages rather than doing sort of typical European languages. That's not to say, of course, that having that ability to speak a language of your kind of broader economic community in the sense of the European space is also not important as well. So that notion of looking at what languages people have and building on that, and and actually making that something that celebrating that in many ways, which you do see schools doing, particularly in the primary schools, maybe a bit less so in the secondary schools, but then building on that and actually developing other languages like Spanish or German would seem to me to be a very good idea. So I think, the issue of multilingualism, as people are saying, is a very complex one. And, we are often considered as a country not to be particularly good at languages, but I think there's some questions in there.
Interestingly, the British Council just last week launched a report about the need for foreign languages in Britain, and in particular named the 10 languages that are most needed, languages which include ones that are very little taught, such as Japanese, Arabic, and Turkish. And it's interesting that this analysis doesn't match the British government's designated list of languages which will be compulsorily learned in primary school from now on, which are much more traditional, I think.
There's no list now.
The list's gone, has it? Oh, right.
No list. Any
But
language.
oh, that's good. Well, that's an advance, so there's a decentralisation there. So it's something we're very much concerned about, the situation in Britain. Coming to English, Wai Yin, obviously Singapore is a country that's had a massive socio-economic success over the last half century. But it's a country with a huge big racial mix, a number of different languages, and by its very nature, for many years, multilingual and multiracial. And yet English seems to underpin everything. Can you tell us something about that? I know you're going to do your plenary later and tie it into what Francois.
I think, as you quite rightly pointed out, Singapore is a very diverse multilingual society. Our ancestors come from China, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, and of course all other parts of the world. So many of our children are already born speaking in their native language, the mother tongue languages, and we learn English in school as a medium of instruction for all subjects. So this is immensely challenging if you just think about it, that you may be speaking Chinese at home, but the minute you go into school, all instruction takes place in English. So there's a huge bridge that you need to cross in order to be able to master the language in the first instance, and then to understand it in the context of the different subject areas. So this calls for a lot of training and bridging programs to bring our children who are not from English language speaking homes into the mainstream English lessons that we conduct. Having said that though, because of this value we place on education, and because English has become such an important place, and that's when I think, I don't know whether Francois would disagree with me, because I just saw your slide which said that you can't really claim causal relationship, and maybe not even correlational analysis relationship between, say, a developing country and the use of language for prosperity. But in the case of Singapore, I think it's widely believed that English is the language that has helped us access global economy and help us to leapfrog the region, which is basically mostly Bahasa speaking, to tap into the multinational companies and all the other developed nations during our developing years. So I don't know what you have to say about that. But because of this belief that English is so important in our society, our challenge now is to maintain multilingualism. Because there is a small segment, it's not a large segment, but there's a small segment of the population, mainly parents who speak English to their children at home, who are agitating for us to relinquish our bilingual policy. That means, instead of insisting that every child should learn the mother tongue language as well as English, they should only be allowed to master English. After all, English is the language of commerce, is the working language in Singapore, so why not? Why not just focus on one language? And of course, this is not acceptable from the ministry's point of view, because from the very beginning, we have maintained bilingualism as the cornerstone, and that is not likely to change. But it just worries us that there should be people in this world where diversity is increasingly being valued, and that they would want to even contemplate the possibility of going into a monolingual system. So this is something that is on our radar screen, and we do encourage our students to learn not just their mother tongue languages, but if they're able to learn another mother tongue language or even a foreign language. So we have schemes to encourage our students to learn Japanese, to learn Korean, to learn Spanish, for example. So I guess in the case of Singapore, it is a very challenging, changing situation as well. I'm thankful for the economic analysis. I shall bring this back to to my ministry and let them have a look at it and to see whether we can think of an economic argument for multilingualism beyond what we know is good for the world and for cultural diversity.
So that's very interesting. I didn't know that. So there is a body of opinion, if you like, a professional group to allow monolingualism, and that monolingualism, unilingualism being English.
Yes.
And that's something that's come from distinctly a multilingual society. And what characterizes this people? Why do they want that? Is it because it's less work, less resources expended on the learning of other languages?
I would say that a lot of these responses are knee-jerk and personal, mainly from parents of students from English-speaking homes. Now, unlike maybe, I don't know, I mean, I find that as a non-Spanish speaker, just because I know English, I can somewhat understand the signs in Spanish, but I can kind of guess what these are. But Chinese is a completely different ballgame altogether. It's a different script. You have to memorize every single letter. Because it's not phonetic, you can't build on it. It just is unique, you know. So you've got to memorize like so many systems and so many symbols and so many of these permutations. So I guess the challenge of multilingualism is that it places enormous demands on our children, on students in school. But the fact is that most of our students are managing. So there is absolutely no reason for even a minority to feel so threatened that they feel that if we were to go on a bilingual route, and which we are, then the students, the children will be disadvantaged because they will not be able to do as well, and therefore their marks will suffer, and therefore they will not be able to get to schools and universities of their choice. So I do want to say that there is a voice, but it's not a very big voice, because I think in our society we do understand the benefits of multilingualism. So I'll talk more about that tomorrow. I just don't want to keep repeating things that I'll say tomorrow, then you have nothing, then I'll have nothing to say to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Wai. I'll come to the audience and see if we can get some an agenda out of the audience and some questions. You can also ask Francois questions about his presentation, but perhaps first I'll throw it back to you, Francois, and see if you just grab the mic. Yeah. If you have any responses to what our panelists have.
Well, yeah, these are extraordinarily interesting questions. I would like to thank you all for raising those very important points. I guess I will just answer them in the same succession, same order. One point that Jan raised was how to actually achieve multilingualism as a societal goal, how to get some young people interested in multilingualism. Yeah, I think this is an important challenge. However, this challenge comes up in very different guises depending on where you are. Many of us in this room come from quite strikingly monolingual cultures. Even in Switzerland, we have those very sharply demarcated language regions, which means that if you wish, you can lead your life fairly successfully in one language only. You don't necessarily have to learn other languages, depending on what you want to do. But multilingualism is a pretty banal, pretty basic fact of life for billions of people around the world, in Asia, in Africa, increasingly in Europe because of the integration of the labor market in the European Union, and this also extends to associate or semi-associate countries like Switzerland. So we do have these, this experience of multilingualism as a matter of course. So just because it is difficult in certain areas does not mean that it is fundamentally, intrinsically so. If you ask young people, I've done some, a few surveys of young people. With a few thousand observations. I'm currently working with a database of over 40,000 young men, but I'm referring now to one that has like 3,200. We asked 15-year-olds, their attitudes about foreign languages and the image of foreign languages and what they expected from learning English and German and Spanish as things that they already studied or things that they might decide to study. And what we found is that, if you start with the sort of very basic, obvious questions, such as, do you like German? Do you like English? You get a very positive response for English because it's cool, because it is associated with rock music or whatever the successor of rock music is for people that age. Whereas, German it is changing, but German nevertheless has retained an image of stiffness and of, and all the images, all the cliches again that you can imagine. However, if you go a little bit beyond the obvious and you ask kids the following question: if somebody learns English as a foreign language, he doesn't need to learn any other foreign language. Agree, disagree, or partly agree, completely agree, partly right. So a 4-point Likert scale. 85% of the kids disagree with this. Only 15% agreed. So if you ask something that goes beyond the obvious, I think many people are aware of the diversity, the multiplicity of this world, and I would think that, okay, sure, there is a popularity of English, and I think it's great, and the rock bands that I listen to happen to sing in English. That's absolutely fine. But then usually the interest of young people does not stop at that. I think it's not that difficult to activate this, particularly if you start at a very early age. One thing that we do in our public school systems is because we have a high degree of immigration, we've got 70 to 80,000 people flooding in Switzerland every year in a country which is a fraction of Chile in terms of land area, and which means lots of languages are represented in primary schools. We have something called éveil aux langues, language awakening, in which the school teacher asks the kids around, what languages do you speak? How do you say this and that in your language? Which means that there is some, reciprocal language teaching and learning, exposure to diversity among the kids. And I think this is doing a whole lot of good by having French-speaking kids learn some words of, it can be Russian, it can be Spanish, it can be Albanian from Kosovo, whatever. So and reciprocally. So I think it is possible to stimulate and stimulate this. Of course, a very important point. May I?
Yeah, are you going on to the
yes,
next?
Yes.
Before you go to the next one, I'd like to just come in a bit there, Francois. It's interesting that you're saying a country that we think of as quite multilingual, like Switzerland, you say that it's perfectly possible in demarcated monolingual areas to get along just in that language. Surely Latin America, is that written on a much larger scale?
Yes.
You have a huge group of people who are basically operating in a Spanish-speaking environment, another 200 million people who are basically operating in a Portuguese medium environment. These are huge internal markets which are perfectly possible to operate as communities. I just want to ask you part of the ethical question. Part of the ethical question is surely to give wider socio-economic groups bigger opportunities, and one of those opportunities is English. But is another ethical question to allow people to remain monolingual and to remain able to operate at a national level within their own language as a professional? And I ask this in the context of, let's say, where we're going in higher education instruction, where sometimes for certain universities we're moving towards an English medium of instruction situation, and in other universities we have a situation that I think this has happened in Chile, where every graduate has to display a certain knowledge of English. Should not an architect in Concepcion de Chile be able to continue to be an architect without knowing English?
Yeah. Well, that's another fascinating question again. Or perhaps let me address this as an aside before I return to the answers to the other points that were raised previously. Yes, I agree that there should be a possibility to remain monolingual for those who really, it's maybe their choice, it may not be a wise one, but there are situations where it is not indispensable to master additional languages, particularly in a huge sociolinguistic context like that of Spanish-speaking or Portuguese-speaking Latin America, quite definitely. This is why I stressed in my talk the fact that the needs are extremely context-dependent. There tends to be an overemphasis or an overestimation of the need to do this or that. The example that you give that an architect in Concepcion who might not really need any other language, would be forced, as part of his studies, to learn another language. In this case, happens to be English, could be another one, but in this case, English. I think this reflects perhaps less a well-balanced appreciation of the value of multilingualism, and perhaps a bit more some of the cliches that I was warning against at the beginning of my talk. There is a lot of that. So it is very important to separate the grain from the chaff, or to quote one poet I like, and that's T.S. Eliot, you remember Murder in the Cathedral. The last temptation was the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. So I think there is a bit of that as well in language education. I would generally encourage situations of choice. One thing that means exploiting certain forms of bilingual education, and that's a point that I was going to address later. Bilingual education is a way of relatively inexpensively making other languages available to large numbers of people. In certain cases, if you offer a bilingual stream, you offer that bilingual stream, but there are also possibilities to offer semi-a la carte, mono and bilingual. One of our universities, Fribourg, which is literally astride the German-French language border, has the two, you can have full tuition either in French or in German, or you can mix as you like, because everything is taught in both languages. So at the same time, usually. So you decide to take this lecture in one language and that lecture in another language, but it counts the same for your ECTS points at the end. I believe that in developing this sort of bilingual education, you offer to the greatest number the possibility to broaden their language skills without necessarily impinging on their actual right to remain monolingual if they so wish. Which
there's certainly been a great trend in that direction in Asia and in...
but then it has to be combined with a notion of choice. And then the right deed has to be done for the right reason. Right? So perhaps a couple of things regarding the value of languages. Yes, I think it is extremely important to remember that people will respond to languages to the extent that they find usefulness in them. Right? So you cannot force people to study things that they consider useless. You can tell them that the range of uses is perhaps broader than they think, and also make them aware of the fact that, again, that's going beyond cliches, that even some small languages may be narrowly economically profitable. There are papers out there which come up with positive rates of return for skills in Irish, Gaelic, and Welsh. So even relatively small languages can deliver economic benefits in a narrow sense. And if you bring in the broader range of benefits that I've called symbolic, I think this further reinforces that conclusion. So it brings in this notion of the value of languages, probably on a larger scale than we think. I think it's the Confederation for British Industry, by the way, has been issuing a series of reports, but which are apparently echoed by this recommendation of the British Council, to the effect that even in Britain, that has the privilege of speaking a language which is immensely influential, it would be in the interest of lots of people to access certain jobs to pay a bit more attention to learning other languages. So again, this brings us back once more to this notion of partnership. Let me just finish with Singapore. I remember doing a project. It was involving 6 countries, including Switzerland and Singapore, about 10 years ago. So we're working with colleagues from Nanyang University. You may, anyway. So we'll talk about names afterwards. And so I had the privilege to carry out interviews with people doing vocational training in Singapore, because in Singapore you have a system quite similar to the one we have in Switzerland, and the one they have in Germany and Austria as well. So we looked at their interest in languages, their proficiency in English, etc. One thing that to me was, the frequency with which young people talked about their fascination for Japanese culture. for non-linguistic reasons. But from there, you can, I think, use this as a springboard to access the linguistic. There is also, I think, one thing that struck me there, but perhaps that's a thing of the past, was that after having pushed English so much, the government decided to launch this Speak Mandarin campaign, precisely in order to preserve the language skills that give Singaporeans such a direct access to a market which is, well, sorry for how little it is, but it's only 1 billion people, right? Right. So I think, you know, there is, you know, pretty obvious case there to the effect that the investment is worthwhile.
¿Alguna pregunta o comentario, inquietud de la audiencia? Se puede ser en español, castellano, o no portugués también, or even in Swedish. And in Chinese? That all forms of Chinese, Wai-Yin, or you prefer Mandarin?
So Mandarin.
Mandarin. Stick to Mandarin.
Okay.
Thank you for a very enlightening presentation. I have to confess I'm totally ignoramus in the field. Just a question, because what you presented today, it's a very, if you wish, Eurocentric view of language and economics, where there's an economic need for multilingualism to create a European identity. Are you aware of research done about the value added of multilingual education outside, let's say in emergent economies, which are by definition multicultural and multilingual, but whose multiple languages and cultures have been stifled or at least hidden in favor of more hegemonic languages? And also, how do you see the commodification of English playing a role in even enhancing a little bit more the gap between the local cultures and languages in favor of a more global view?
Before you answer that, Francois, can I just see if there are any other comments so we can deal with 2 or 3 at the same time? Yes, Howard.
I'd like to challenge Mr. Green, if I could, that perhaps your view is somewhat optimistic. Is it possible that multiculturalism and multilingualism can also be fragmentary? I'm thinking about Nigeria, where I worked for several years with 4 or 5 distinct languages, and English was viewed as a language which brought the nation together rather than being divisive, which the other languages were often viewed as being divisive.
Anybody else? Okay. Mr. Shipton.
I would just ask Francois to elaborate a little bit on something that you touched on, which was the idea that for different social economic groups in one society, the return on investment may actually be different for the different groups, and in my mind, the danger therefore that perhaps by introducing by a linguistic intervention there, you could be enhancing the differential between the socially disadvantaged who are unable to, although they have the language and they learn English, are still unable to overcome the other inhibitions that they have to advancement.
Okay, the gentleman started by suggesting we may have started with a Eurocentric point of view. So can I ask you, Wai-Yin, to make some comments on that? Because I think a lot of your experience must be to do with it, because, and we had another point which was around identity. To what extent is this whole issue around identity, and to what extent is it around instrumentality as a culturally neutral skill?
I think it's quite true that the example was of Sweden. It is Eurocentric. It is, because there's not a study of Asia. But I would say the underlying principles could apply. And certainly in my country, when it comes to language policy, It's a mixture of national identity, culture, as well as instrumentality. I mean, there's no doubt about it that in choosing English as the language, as a working language of Singapore, we are so driven by economic concerns, because at that time, we needed English. We needed English in order to be able to access the rest of the world, as I said before. But then there was a very interesting point about Nigeria as well, and does English unify? I would say that the second reason, or maybe I should call it the first reason, the second reason is economic. The first reason was also for national unity. We have a country which has like 4 different races. We speak 4 different languages. How are we ever going to understand each other if we don't have a common language that hopefully is rather neutral? Because I must say that with due respect to Francois, and I'm so interested in his research, and I read his long reports online as well. You said in one of your reports, and I agreed with you totally, and that is that people do not make language policies because of economics. A lot of it's politics. You can't really separate the politics from the economics of language, because language has so much to do with ourselves, our identity, our voice, our culture, our heritage. So it's not easy to just put an economic spin on it and say, okay, come on, let's just pursue this language because that's going to give us the greatest economic returns. I don't know of any society who would do that without committing political suicide. But perhaps there is, and I'm just speaking in ignorance.
Gary, have you got any thoughts on the questions?
On issues to do with unification? Well, it is a very interesting question. Is the UK a monolingual country or not? I'm not really sure that it is, and it hasn't been for an awfully long time. But we still have we have official languages, and we have policies within Europe to include more than one language within the curriculum, so all children learn a number of languages.
Is it an elitist activity, foreign language learning in Britain?
Is it an elitist activity? That's a very interesting question. It depends on what you mean by language learning. Do you mean within the schools, or do you mean within your own community? What do you mean?
Well, I guess I meant within the schools, because I was bringing it back to the Latin American context, where traditionally knowing English has been the preserve of the elite, who have very often attended private schools, which only the rich or the comfortable have access to.
I was sort of thinking about it. In a sense, learning a language is part of the curriculum, isn't it? It's like learning maths or geography. And that's, in many ways, how it's treated in many countries. And certainly, I think that's how a lot of children experience language learning. They don't recognize the kind of, I suppose, the issues of identity initially, and they don't recognize necessarily the economic value of learning a language. It's part of what happens to them when they turn up between the hours of 9 and 5 in school. And I think that's part of the big problem, that it's not to do with the kind of excitement and interest that you might have and develop in issues. So I don't see it as being an elitist activity. It's very interesting to see, that most of the speeches at the beginning were in Spanish, including the one which is very impressive from the ambassador. And I think that sort of somehow demonstrates that maybe ideas about language and Britain have changed a little bit, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's kind of elitist within the schools. So,
can I pass the word to Janet before going on to Francois, because most of the questions you'll have had time to think about the questions.
Yes, maybe an interesting perspective on elitism and languages in Sweden. In Swedish context, English is not a foreign language according to the national curriculum. English is one of 3 core subjects that is introduced right the way through the system from grade 1 to the end of compulsory schooling. It's only from grade 6 that a foreign language is introduced. Of course, this has a particular history in access to English in Sweden, but I see this policy happening, or something reflecting that policy happening, in a number of northern European countries now. Norway is not so dissimilar, and as I suggested, Finland is quite similar, though it doesn't state that in the policy curriculum. Whether this is good or bad is another question. And what its economic value is, I leave that to Francois to calculate. And I'd like to invite you to Sweden, because Sweden has the most amazing set of RAD data, I think probably in Europe, perhaps in the world, I don't know. On everything, from the cradle to the grave. You can check on every single resident of Sweden, and we have access to it at my university. So it offers very exciting data opportunities to really investigate this issue of multilingualism. So
Can I just ask for clarification, Janet? You're saying that English, in the Swedish educational system, English comes in at grade 1 for essentially everyone.
Yes.
And then there's another foreign language which can come in at grade 6 when you're...
And the first choice of foreign languages in Sweden is Spanish, and rising rapidly. And there is a shortage of Spanish teachers, I would add. So, yes.
So what we see there is really a commitment in Sweden to the concept of multilingualism, going beyond the obvious economic instrumentality.
Certainly, but with the proviso, of course, it's a very small country. We're talking 9 million population, and it's a relatively rich country. So these factors are more possible in such a context. So I don't want to draw comparisons.
No, and I think we've got to draw, if you like, the differences and see how these principles coming from what are small and rich countries to the huge
John, can I just...
Latin American context. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, your question was about other contexts, really, and I'm doing some work at the moment in Pakistan, which is a very diverse country linguistically. Even in the area that I'm working in the Punjab, there are 600 plus languages spoken in local communities, and Urdu, which is, of course, the national language, is not a language that's particularly seen as a positive unifying language. So what the current policy is, or the new policy is again to move back to English medium education. And you can imagine the issues that raises. But still, in people's minds, and a lot of this comes from pressures from families. This is the data that they've got from various surveys. It's the parents that are saying, well, if my children learn this language and it's introduced from the very early stages of schooling, then they're going to be more successful. Now that's an attitude, that's a belief. Whether that's a valid belief, and particularly when you think about issues around the kinds of communities that you're talking about, where they probably, in most cases, will work within that linguistic world that they grew up in. So whether you really see that as being a sensible policy on the part of the government is a very moot point. But I think it's clearly in the air, this notion that across the world that, well, if we learn English, it's going to be really good for us. But I think it's very interesting, the whole business of diversity. And I go back to my point about, well, let's look at what languages people actually use on a daily basis. And my children are both bilingual, but they're not bilingual. They're bilingual in a community language. They speak Farsi because their mother's Iranian. They also learnt languages at school, and one of them spent time in Latin America and now speaks pretty good Spanish. But those, part of that is kind of cultural kind of choice, the fact that I'm, of course, a linguist, and many people in the Iranian community are quite amazed that my children are bilingual, whereas their children aren't, because they took a different policy line. They took the policy, well, we're living in Britain now, they've got to learn English. Never mind Farsi, it won't be relevant for them. And of course, it's just such a complex question. But in terms of what the possibilities might be for my daughter, in terms of somebody who is, she speaks a little bit of French, she speaks pretty good Spanish, she has Farsi, she's a bilingual Farsi speaker. In terms of job opportunities, well, I'll leave you to think about that,
Thanks. I will respond to the various points in the order in which they were raised. As regards the, well, Eurocentric or other-centric perspectives, sure, I think things look quite different depending on where you stand. I would like to quote two examples, nevertheless, starting with Australia, where there has for quite some time now, since the early 90s, in fact, been a concern for preserving a range of heritage languages carried usually by immigration as a way to make it easier for Australian businesses or businesses based in Australia to export. Incidentally, there is this common perception that language skills are useful to sell. They're just as useful to buy, because in a very integrated world, what matters almost as much as your clients is your suppliers. And language skills, at least that's what we found in Switzerland, language skills tend to be used not so much to sell, because when it comes to selling and advertising, you can delegate this to specialists, and you can even outsource part of it. It's in terms of buying, accessing the best suppliers, the best raw materials, the best prices, the best delivery terms. So in Australia, there has been this interest for a while. It sort of like waxes and wanes over the years. As I said, I was there just last month. I'm going there again next week. And it is a country where there is, I think right now, renewed interest for this, largely because of the proximity to Asia. They realize that, well, having English as they already do, what else can they do to improve their economic success in a world, in a globalized marketplace? And this means developing the language skills that will make it easier to access markets like Indonesia, India, China, of course. In China proper, I was just a year ago, actually, almost a year ago, at this European China. They have these regular sort of summits on what they consider strategic issues, and one of them is multilingualism. So at the EU-China multilingualism conference, perhaps some of you actually attended this, I don't know. I think there were some people from the British Council there. There was quite a lot of interest from the Chinese in bilingualism, and in particular in the economics of multilingualism, and things being done on at a Chinese scale. They said, oh yeah, we just got interested in this quite recently, but oh yes, we've organized a conference with 200 delegates just a few months ago, the sort of thing that we can only dream about, but they just operate on a different scale than we do. Now this interest, I believe, is there. It is incipient. It'll be interesting to see how it develops. You've raised the issue of commodification. That's a question that, as a non-native speaker of English myself, I find it very difficult to answer. I would tend to consider that this is not too serious. Why so? Because I think that there is such cultural vitality in the multifaceted English-speaking world that literary creation, musical creation, and so on and so forth is not in any way imperiled by the merchandization or commodification of English. It is there, of course, and I think it is important to raise the point to say, do not lock the language into that role. Remember that the most interesting things about the language are elsewhere. They are in T.S. Eliot or or in rock bands or whatever, right? Remember that, and I think it's important, particularly for people in the British Council, to keep reminding their clients that the value, I think, of English is not only in material things. Let me now turn to the optimism question. Alan, I would agree with you up to a point. But yes, I'm an optimist, but my optimism resides in something else. With that respect to that particular point, I think that, well, if you think that many languages are divisive, now your answer may be, well, uniformization. I think this is dangerous, and I think it is potentially even more disruptive. I don't think that divisiveness, having said that, comes per se from linguistic diversity. The most bitter civil wars have been fought among languages with the same language. We can talk about Yugoslavia. Right now we can think about Syria. I don't think that language is the driving force of divisiveness and conflict. I think suppression of difference actually is far more dangerous, and this may include suppression of linguistic difference. So I would not, be too worried about that. I don't think this is the real risk. Now, I think where you're very right is in underlining, as Y has also done, the fact that the complex balance of multilingualism is deeply political. And we cannot, sort of like sweep the political aside. It is there, and it has to be part of our thinking about linguistic diversity. Finally, talking about perhaps the most difficult question of all right now is the one about socioeconomic groups, multilingualism as a prestige or elite thing. This is extraordinarily difficult. There is a lot of research right now, not so much in economics as in political science and sociolinguistics, about multilingualism from the top or multilingualism from below. Because, all over the world we have those cases, particularly in Africa, where multilingualism is something experienced from below as a matter of course. Multilingualism in and of itself is not necessarily something that is confined to prestige. However, if you want to spread certain new forms of bilingualism, the problem does arise, and this is connected with what we call in economics standing. Standing is, if you look at the distribution or the redistribution of material but also symbolic influence and position of prestige in society, you can think of it in terms of socioeconomic groups, upper, lower social classes, etc. But at the same time, you also have to consider other dimensions of standing. So one thing that does not matter is the redistribution of power between people with blue eyes and people with brown eyes. That does not matter. Between social classes it matters. Between people who come from one linguistic background or another linguistic background, it matters as well. So you have to combine these things in your estimation of the effects. This is where English is in a very delicate position, precisely because there is, of course, a socioeconomic dimension, which I think can be quite adequately mastered by, its problems can be handled by making the language, available through various forms of creative bilingual education. At the same time, because English is the native language of some people, but not all, it's apparently the native language of about 8% of the world population. 8%. Not 80, not 28, right? In the case of Europe, it is a native language of 14% of the population of the European Union. So it remains worldwide a minority language. To what extent does the emphasis of English channel an overproportionate part of material and symbolic resources to people who are the native speakers of it? This is where I think there is a difficult challenge, and in order to this not to be divisive, there again, I think English has to be seen as part of an agenda for linguistic diversity.
Okay, thank you, Francois. I'll come to the audience again in a minute, and so please think of some questions or comments. It's interesting to bring out this difference between the instrumentality and the economic usefulness of English on the one hand, which I think is very often an argument that's addressed, if you like, the ministers of education and or ministers of economy as well. And what's under those things are not necessarily important when you're talking to a 14-year-old Peruvian in secondary school. Maybe better job when in 15 years' time, who may well be more interested in the rock band angle on things, or Manchester United, or the American television program. And I think we ought to bear in mind that within this conversation, the two-day conversation, we're talking about English within wider society as well. So I'd like to really try and bring the conversation to Latin American realities. But we had some comments over there. Yes, Adam.
Yes. Good morning. Oh, yes. Okay. Good morning to everyone. I'm the director of CNPq in Brazil, which is the federal research agency from the Ministry of Science and Technology. where I would like to bring the issue of science and technology within the language, English language. I will not take into the cultural side of what Francois said, but nowadays in Brazil we have the Science Without Border, as you know, where we have to send 101,000 academics abroad. And we send the 30,000 first ones abroad, they knew English, upper class, and then later on we didn't have anyone who spoke English anymore. And then you see countries very resistant, like France or Germany and things like that. And they offered in graduate programs, they offer English subjects. So English is, Francois, still a lingua franca. I will not tackle the issue of economics or even cultural, but people need to know English. It's the most spoken language in science and technology, and the journals and where you have access to it. Also, Brazil is suffering, and I think it's other Latin American countries as well, because we have insisted in our language, in Portuguese and in Spanish, that everyone needs to speak that language, but we never succeed. And in Brazil, we are not succeeding in attracting people, because a Korean person, an engineer, will not learn Portuguese to come and stay for 6 months in one of our outstanding labs. They will learn English, and then they will come. So it's our job to accommodate that. I'm just talking about the reality that I live in every day. So this is my comment about science and technology coming into that issue.
That's a great comment from Brazil and bringing in science. I'd like to come back to you in a few minutes when you've had a chance to think, because you've given us the problem. Where might the solution lie in sort of, you've thought?
I'm sorry, the solution?
Yeah.
The solution is to have our children to learn English in schools more, at the university, and we have the English, we have one of the chairs here, the English Without Border, a program by the Ministry of Education. We just found out that our people don't speak English, and we might keep isolated. I mean, I'm from a German background, and I can talk about that. That English still is a language that you move around, and traveling around the world, yeah. English is the language. It can become Mandarin in a few years, but today, in the next decade, will be English.
Yeah, that does seem to be the general. I was at a conference in Spain of a group of European academics from a variety of European universities last week. It was a conference about English medium of instruction, and there seemed to be in that conference a general agreement on the proposition that an academic in Europe, I don't just mean a university teacher, but an academic. Can you hear me? Something wrong with my microphone. There was a consensus, an agreement in that conference that essentially for any European academic who was doing research, not necessarily just a teacher, but anyone who was doing research actually needed to know English in today's world, and that because the people who are dealing with the same specialization as you will not be speaking the same language as you, and so there needs to be a lingua franca, which turns out to be English. So I think I take what you're saying, and you've given the solution, okay, to learn English in schools, but I think, as we'll see, it's not that easy to learn English in schools. And in fact, the reason why we have Sweden and Singapore represented here is that what we'll see is that the countries which have the most success in learning English are the countries which have, in some way, for whatever reason, managed to integrate English beyond the school and within society. Yeah, was it Thomas?
Yeah, question first of all for Francoise. What effect, if any, has the Common European Framework for Languages had upon what you're describing as the economics of language? And the second question is, well, for the same, for the panel, what effect do you think, in your opinion, has the Common European Framework had on policy in general, worldwide, in your different contexts? And what sort of washback effect do you think that it's had?
So should we go back to Francois? And we've got science and technology from Brazil and the Common European Framework. Then we'll come back to the audience. Sorry.
Let me start with the second question, which is more self-contained. I think it has had a very important effect at many levels, largely because, well, some of them are linked to the politics of language teacher associations. I won't go into that. But the other is that it simply gave us a relatively workable benchmark with which all kinds of studies could be carried out. It would be very difficult to compare the results from various studies if it were not for the possibility to go back to a metric which is relatively stabilized. And I think this is what the Common European Framework of Reference helps us to do. I mentioned the study of over 40,000 young men, and part of that study addresses, you know, their well, of course, self-declared competence in various languages. And the only way, short of testing, to objectify this, you know, to make it more objective, was to refer to something which, in fact, is the Common European Framework. I think there is still some resistance to it, but by and large, it is accepted as a useful instrument. That would be my answer. As regards the other question, I do find it very intriguing because I think what we have there is pardon me, but a bit of a confusion between English only and English plus. What you're suggesting, if we take what you said to your logical conclusion, is an eviction, a displacement of Portuguese or other languages by English. If that's what you want, I think that you are playing with fire because you're ushering in a unilingual world. This is why I stressed the importance of languages in higher education before. If that's what you are saying, if it is not what you're saying, well then, this brings us back to the need to come up with multilingual syllabuses and multilingual schemes. See, there is, right nowadays, I think there is a massive confusion between internationalization and uniformization. Many people say, oh, you know, everything is going international. Higher education is international. Now, if higher education is international, it means that you bring in elements from various parts of the world and you try to exploit this diversity for the development and the transmission of knowledge. Right. And I believe, for other reasons, that the development of knowledge, as well as its transmission, benefit from being able to plug into the resources of different languages instead of being completely uniform. So if we do this, then internationalization means multilingual education programs. Yes, it does mean that if you get some Chinese students in Brazil, you will select, and you know, it's a very big pool of people, you will select people who are willing to develop a certain degree of receptive competence, not necessarily productive, but receptive competence in Portuguese. This is something that we have not at all addressed during the session this morning, but which I think is extraordinarily important, and in Europe we call this intercomprehension. So the use of receptive skills as distinct from productive skills in the sharing and transmission of knowledge. This means that you would expect people to learn enough of another language to understand it and therefore contribute to a genuine internationalization instead of uniformization. If you are into a world in which Portuguese is considered completely irrelevant for research, well, be my guest, but I think it would be a mistake, precisely because in the long term, and I think also this is one of the ambiguities of our university authorities. You told us, John, that you were at the LIRU meeting, League of European Research Universities, that's the one, I guess, or was it the Coimbra group?
No, this was a British Council policy.
Oh, it is a British Council. All right.
Segovia.
All right. See, all right. There's another, because there is, several leagues of universities where university rectors get together and they debate the language policy, in particular the extent to which there should be convergence towards one language for international student mobility. So one possibility, of course, is to have things in one language only, but this probably makes a mockery of the very concept of internationalization, and it ruins all the benefits that we can get from plugging into different expertise, different ways of looking at the world, which is why I would favor another system. I teach, most of my teaching is in French, some of it is in English, and so just an example. I have a general introductory economics course where most of my students are non-speakers of French in Geneva. And it's an introductory course in microeconomics. So the first and the second courses are available in English. As we go on, they are no longer available in English. And what is the idea there? The idea is to indeed attract as many foreign students as we can to internationalize our student body, which is very international to begin with, but then is to sort of facilitate for them, usher them into studies that will take place at least partly through the medium of French. But to facilitate this, we offer courses in English. I hope we could also offer courses in other languages. I wish we could do Spanish, for example. But the idea is that the students, wherever they come from, develop over 1 or 2 years the capacity to understand some of the lectures in French. And even if they write up their papers in another language, possibly English, that they do develop the capacity to operate multilingually. And the idea is the same for our students who are native speakers of French, to develop the capacity, even if they turn in their papers in French, to understand lectures in English, or potentially in the Faculty of Law, for example, we do this with German. Right? So the real question is, do we want a uniform or a multiple world? Ultimately, that's what it comes down to, and that's a real responsibility.
If I can just have my own take on our Brazilian colleagues' comment, I'm sure you wouldn't be suggesting any diminution of the importance of Portuguese within Brazil or indeed the world. And indeed, well, it wasn't long ago. I can't even remember exactly what President Lula said, but he was very keen on maintaining Portuguese and having people come and speak to him in Portuguese at the time. But perhaps there does seem to be a growing recognition of English. But it's interesting you say that everyone needs to learn English, and I'd suggest that what you really mean, you tell me if I'm wrong or not, is not that everyone needs to learn English, because Brazil is a huge internal market, but that for purposes of equity, everyone should have the opportunity to learn English. Yeah? And so the economic, the competitive driver means that you need a lot more scientists who do speak English, yeah, but not necessarily everyone. So, good. I see more hands now, Madam.
I just want to support the idea of that giving priority to English language teaching and learning does not necessarily lead to curtailing opportunities for learning other languages. I would like to present the example of my country, Cuba. English has been the most widely taught foreign language in all periods of our history. However, back in the 70s, we had a professional community that was language competent in other languages, Russian, Polish, Czech, and others. When the collapse of the socialist camp in Europe came and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, we practically closed the Russian language major at the university because we didn't have students. However, fortunately, we realized then, back in the late 80s, that we could not simply ignore the development we have had in Russian language teaching in Cuba. So we expanded the major and we gave students the opportunity of learning Russian and a second foreign language. Most of them were Russian English, Russian French, and most of them back in the 90s found jobs in the second language. However, now we are returning to employers requiring people who are competent in Russian and in another foreign language. So we are still, and we will give priority to English, but definitely we want to expand opportunities. It's very expensive. That depends on the availability of teachers and resources. But as a policy, as an educational policy, we believe that the more languages you learn, the more opportunities you have to learn about other people's culture, and that will bring more understanding that is so necessary at present. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a very useful perspective, and obviously a very long-sighted, far-sighted policy. I could see people nodding around the audience. There's a lady here over that side who was going to make a comment.
Good morning. Thank you. I would like to ask for some perhaps easy pointers regarding the picture that I'm going to describe. We are a country in which we have 25 languages plus Spanish.
Did you tell us which country?
It's Guatemala. And at the same time, within education, within the ministry, we do believe that English does bring prosperity. But when you are talking about resources, and since we're talking about economics, sometimes the struggle with between giving resources, budget, to the education of foreign languages, mean English, and the national languages that we call them, it is difficult. So I would really appreciate something related to regarding that sense. How can we give proof that being a multicultural nation can balance and can live with an English for Prosperity program?
Okay, thanks. That's a very useful question, because if you like, it goes to the heart of what this conference is about, which is solving local problems, which are of very different circumstances. We've seen one in Cuba, different languages, different foreign languages competing for resources potentially, and one in Guatemala with foreign languages competing with indigenous languages and the mastery of Spanish, and any further language being an L3. I wonder if is there anyone else who's got a specific issue or problem to solve that I'd like to throw to the panel, and we could finish off by maybe making some suggestions about what the discourse should be about solving.
Just to take advantage of the silence, it's of course from my perspective, it's not a problem from a national perspective, but it was the question I was going to ask, which was struck by the comment about how learning a language or learning English could become a new kind of minimum standard, with the example of literacy being kind of a minimum standard, and maybe English can be a minimum standard. In practical terms, in policy making, does that therefore mean that there should be a kind of hierarchical approach, where, for all the advantages and the benefits of promoting multilingualism, in practical terms, we should be looking at, fixing on what can we do first, maybe with English first for where it stands, and then looking at the separate stage of kind of bringing in the other multilingualism as a second stage? Or is it something which has to be brought in all the way together from the beginning and developed kind of from the start?
Anybody else from the audience before I pass over to the panel?
Okay, well, I mean, there are a number of things that I'd like to comment on. I mean, one of the issues that I'm conscious of, there was a piece of data that I came across in the last couple of days about the number of patents that are currently recorded, and America still, North America, the US, not quite sure what the politically correct term is for that country here, but has the majority, but the country that is second in the world is China. And I'm also very conscious as an academic, I have a multicultural community that I belong to, but there's an awful lot of publication that is not in English that I can't access because, for example, I don't speak Chinese. One of my colleagues does a lot of work with Greece and has developed a reasonable knowledge of Greece so that he can access the local literature, so he can study the issues that local teachers who write in Greek as well as in English talk about, because of course people write differently about their contexts in the kind of journals that are local from perhaps the kind of things they might say on a national basis. So to come over to this question about a basic standard and multilingualism, I think, I mean, again, we've got lots of examples here where people arrive at school. It sounds to me that if you think about the world, many people arrive at school multilingual anyway. It's the add-on that you want, and it's which other languages that you want to deal with. And I mean, I guess it very much depends on where you are in the world, where you're sitting, where your trading partners are. So, for example, I'm very conscious that in Australia, one of the very big growth languages is Chinese. There's a lot of work being done there on developing Chinese, whereas you could look back into Australian history where English was very, very dominant and other languages weren't considered at all. But now there's a recognition there. So it's also, we have global languages like English or Spanish or Portuguese, and you have issues to do with then choice about what you're going to do. And I think local issues are very important. And another issue that always strikes me, you talked about, I also, for my sins, tried to learn Chinese for a while. I'd done a lot of work in China. And you look at the issue of pinyin, which must be a very interesting debate, I imagine, that goes on a regular basis about whether you should switch from a character-based system to an alphabetic system. Now, if you had an alphabetic system for Chinese, actually, would English still be the dominant language in the world? I wonder. But at the same time, because of the way that China operates in its kind of economic realm and the kind of issues that it's involved in, maybe the fact that they maintain the character-based system actually is helpful to them. So you have that, you maintain that internal market, but at the same time you're training people, lots of work in development of bilingual schools and even bilingual cities in China. So lots of interest in developing particularly English, but other languages as well. But at the same time, there's a certain sense that the local language is still important, or a very big sense that the local language is still important for all the reasons that we've been talking about. So you've got to think about, I think, both the position in the world, where you're at. So in South America, the markets you're talking about, the linkages, the local context, the fact that we recognize that people are already multilingual when they arrive in school, and then say, well, then where from there? And of course, the decisions are based on the international perspective as well as, I suppose, the regional perspective as well. So I would have thought in somewhere like Chile, Portuguese would be an interesting other language, but I don't get the sense that Portuguese is learned very much in the Spanish-speaking world, which surprises me, considering it's is it the fifth biggest language in the world? So lots of issues there that need consideration.
And a question, Gavi, how successful were your Chinese studies?
Well, my big problem was the reading, but I had some success in the sense that I could, by the end of my study, it was 2 years of doing 1 3-hour class a week in an evening, and I had this wonderful sense that I could actually read the characters and work out that this was a computer shop. So, but when it come to actually surviving, in terms of actually going into a restaurant and ordering food, I failed completely. And unless there was what I called a pointy menu, which was a menu with pictures on it.
I ask the question for a reason, because sometimes this discourse, this debate, the conversation goes on as if the learning of English was an on-off switch.
Yeah.
It's not. Learning a foreign language to any level, to an A2 level of competence, never mind a C1 level of competence that you need to really operate international,
Sure.
requires a huge amount of individual resource from the learner that is going to be spent in some other ways.
And we recognise that, and I think one of the issues that we don't invest enough time in is actually looking at the research into language learning and saying, well, you haven't actually mentioned second language acquisition at all in this conference yet, but we do understand a lot about what needs to happen, and it is complex to get to that kind of level. So yes, I could get to a certain level, and that suited my purposes at that juncture. So
okay, can I pass to Wai-Yin?
I mean, I really feel for the colleague who spoke about the allocation of resources. When the ones are unlimited, resources are so limited, where do you put your resources? That's a very interesting question. In fact, I just come from an ASEAN English Language Policy Forum a week ago. And I would say that there's so many similarities between what's happening here in this part of the world and ASEAN as well. Because like your country, there are many languages spoken in each of these ASEAN countries. And we are all at different developmental trajectories. Yet the desire to learn English is so strong, mainly because there is actually talk of a common ASEAN market by 2015. And English has been adopted as the working language for ASEAN. So because of that, there's a huge impetus to make sure that the students are ready to learn English and to be able to communicate with everybody in ASEAN countries. One thing I've learned from my colleagues in these countries which do not have so much resourcing is there is a kind of hierarchical approach that Andrew talked about, which is first you meet your local needs. I mean, whatever works for you locally and whatever you need locally to survive without thinking too much about globalization or internationalization right at the get-go, especially if your resources are limited. I'm talking about Myanmar here, I'm talking about Laos, I'm talking also about Vietnam in the initial stages. But I've also realized that as the economies prosper and they do better, they are better able to place their resources into foreign language teaching and to prioritize which are the languages they want to focus on. So Vietnam, for example, has chosen English, French and Russian, I mean, mainly also because of a lot of common political background, not unlike this part of the world as well. To do that, though, the challenge is immense because you need to allocate resources to make sure that your teachers are well trained. And this is where the Common European Framework kicks in. I was really intrigued to find that Malaysia, Vietnam, they are starting to benchmark their teachers against the Common European Framework. That the teachers are expected to be taking a sort of proficiency test to see where they are. And if they, in the Philippines as well, actually. And if they don't meet a certain minimum standard, then they have to make sure that they get the training necessary in order to bridge the gap. Nevertheless, it's a long road, it's expensive. It is expensive. Wherever they can get foreign help, whether working with British Council or New Zealand or Canada, for anywhere that they can get help from, or Hawaii, the East-West Center in Hawaii, for example. So that makes these linkages to make the journey a lot easier. So I guess, depending on your trajectory and your level of development, we just do the very best we can and make sure that wherever we put our money gives us the best returns. I can't talk about Singapore now because otherwise tomorrow I have nothing to say. But maybe for the Singapore example, it's slightly different because again, we have taken quite a different pathway. But maybe we can somehow join the dots and begin to see how such a complex issue is possible. I mean, there are possible solutions, although it may take long if we all work together and we try to learn from each other and benefit each other.
Wai-Yin, I've got a question for you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Over the coffee break, we were talking about the social status of teachers, the pay of teachers, this sort of thing. Any if you look at any international comparability index, Singapore is a very successful educational system. And you've obviously seen other educational systems in the ASEAN region. What do you see as being, is there a serious connection between, if you like, the standing of teachers in society and the success of an educational system?
I would think so. I mean, the McKinsey reports, this seminal report, how the world's best education systems keep getting better. I think they made a remark to say that the quality of the students cannot exceed the quality of its teachers. Singapore, unlike many countries around the world, hire from the top third of every cohort. So it's not like the bottom, and if you can't teach, you know, but basically it's that if you can, and you should, then you should teach. And because of that, the Ministry of Education is very keen to raise the standing of teachers. For example, for teachers in a school, there is a career path. You don't have to just be a school leader, you don't just have to be a curriculum specialist, but if you start off as a teacher in a school, you can move to become a senior teacher, and then a lead teacher, and then a master teacher, and then a principal master teacher. And with each of these promotions come a very attractive salary scale, with the principal master teacher being equivalent to a deputy director in the Ministry of Education. So this actually helps to signal to the public that it is important to pay our teachers well, to reward them, to attract the best people into a profession, and they should be, and it should be respected as well. Having said that, because our parents are getting more educated, I don't know whether it's the same in Latin America, but certainly there's a lot of challenges that parents issue to teachers. They confront teachers, they question the teacher's ability, they write long letters of complaints. I used to be principal of a school, so I've seen lawyers, I've seen lots of people threatening to sue everybody for some reason. But I would say that in our society, because of the signaling mechanisms that we have used, the standing of teaching is still very high.
Janet, have you got anything to say on this from your experience?
Maybe I can refer to a recent publication, and I'm not sure that I can get his name right, but Professor Pasai Sandholm, would you know him, Francois? No, from Pasai Sandholm, I think. I'm not sure. Anyway, he is from Finland, a professor who's researched education change in Finland and looked particularly at the quality of education in Finland in relation to the PISA rating, which you probably know Finland is one of the top nations. And he came to speak to us at our university a few weeks ago, and knowing that Finland was previously, quotes, owned by Sweden, phrased his, this is his words, not mine, phrased his presentation very sensitively and very appropriately. What he said was that in his view, the situation in Sweden was not so different to the situation in Finland. He was, to some extent, apologetic about the PISA rating of Finland, and he claimed that the issue with PISA is that it presents data that is measurable. In Sweden, there is much that is happening that is of high quality, but it can't be measured in the way that the PISA data operates. So his argument was that there is a lot of good stuff happening across those different countries in the Nordic region, which is very similar. What has happened apparently in Finland, and this was very interesting for me to learn about, is that back in the 1970s and 1980s, Finland was a bit anxious about going for the neoliberal model of education, which might include issues of testing and quality management, standards, and all the rest of it. They just didn't, they worried about it, and so they didn't jump into it very quickly. Whereas Sweden, for instance, did very quickly. And they kept thinking that they actually needed to change and do what other countries were doing, because clearly this neoliberal model was the model that it was viewed by everyone as being the most valid. However, then the PISA results came out in around 1990, which showed Finland as top of the list. And they thought, oh, maybe we're doing something right after all. Maybe we won't change. Maybe we'll stick to our conservative view of what education is. And that's what they've done, and remarkably, very interestingly, it's been very successful in PISA terms. What they have are very, very highly qualified teachers. They accept only the top grade applicants to university as teacher students, and they normally expect them to, of course, get a master's, and I'm told by colleagues who've applied for teaching jobs in Finland that if you haven't got a PhD, you might not get a job. So that puts a very different spin. In terms of salary, though, and in terms of the incremental opportunity for progress, it doesn't happen. Because in Finland, it's a very flattened model of social policy, social engineering, we could call it, where everyone needs to be positioned rather in the middle. So there aren't these opportunities for promotion in Finland, or in Sweden for that matter, that one might see in other contexts. So it's interesting just to reflect on the differences.
Thank you, Janet. It's lunchtime, but I'll just pass the microphone for a final comment to Francois.
So there will be three final comments. The first one is in brief reaction to what Andy has said. Perhaps I should, my parallel with literacy did not imply that I consider that English should be made a minimum standard. Standard carries this notion of obligation, of something that everybody must achieve. The parallel was in terms of how one particular type of skill impacts on earnings or access to jobs, etc. It doesn't follow from this that it should be a standard for everybody. I think what it implies is that it is important to make it widely available, I think just like skills in additional languages, but preserving the right for some people who see no need for it to remain monolingual, as John was saying before. So it's not, the implication is not in terms of standards. However, I think the implication is in terms of general access to education, and you've made an important point by stressing that we're not necessarily only talking about formal education, primary, secondary, etc., but we're also talking about opportunities to acquire knowledge as part of continuing education. I think this is a very, very valid point. My second point is in response to the colleague from Guatemala. Guatemala is an interesting case, largely because it is one of the few countries where the costs and benefits of moving from a unilingual to a bilingual education through the medium of Maya has been formally evaluated. I think it was called the PRONEBI program, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you. And that has been evaluated by some colleagues from the World Bank. I think you've got several questions there, in fact three. One is, what is the value of relatively small languages, and what is the value of of maintaining them? This can be addressed, and if you want, we can talk about existing resources about this, by using the sort of evaluation techniques that have been applied to many European cases. It's of course not the same thing, but it's not entirely different. As regards the English, in that context, I think English is quite clearly something that you can approach through human capital theory and the evaluation of human capital. Perhaps an important point, though, one which is often overlooked, is that the cost of bilingualizing an education system, the cost of moving from a system that operates only through one language to a system that offers both, is much lower than is commonly believed. So colleagues and I have done this for, in the case of the Basque Country. And we ended up with an estimate of the additional cost that was to 0.5 percentage point the same that colleagues from the World Bank had arrived at when looking at the PRONEBI program of teaching through the medium of Mayan in addition to Spanish. The extra cost to the education system is about 3%. If you want to maintain another language, introduce it in the education system, this is what it's going to cost, and it's probably going to taper off after a few years. So people very often have wild estimates of, my God, how expensive it is to offer many languages. Well, no, because you're going to have to school the kids anyway. You need this, you need the textbooks, you need the classrooms, you need the teachers, and teachers typically make up about 82% of educational spending in an education system. So these costs have to be incurred anyway, no matter what language you use for schooling. So adding another language or offering tuition through the medium of another language typically carries a very modest cost. So that's one thing I haven't been able to say so far. Multilingualism is quite accessible financially. right? Last thing I would like to say is that I'm extremely jealous of some of the people around this panel because of their exposure to languages I like just for the sound of it. I don't speak them. I love to listen to Swedish, and I love above all to listen to Farsi. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Ricardo is going to tell us something about lunch, but before that, can we have a round of applause for our panelists, please?